I've just been thinking that you get to a point in your life where it's the last chapter.
The new day brings new hope. Lives we've led, the lives we've yet to lead. New day, new ideas, a new you.
I was thinking about starting this video with a lot of hyperbole, making a lot of grand statements and declarations, but I think I'd rather start it like I always do. Mad Men, Person to Person, Season 7, Episode 14. This is the end, folks. The end of an era. By now we all know where Don's journey leaves him. We all know how it ends. When I first saw it, I was sure immediately that it was Don who wrote the ad. It had to be. All the signs pointed there. And I think that now, even talking to you, I do still believe that. I really do think that it was Don who wrote, "I'd like to give the world a Coke." And I'm going to get to why and my thoughts on that very soon. But it was the opposite view. Not that Peggy wrote it, which I don't believe at all. The show, I mean, you don't cut from this shot of an enlightened Don finally realizing what truth he'd been searching for in his cross-country odyssey to that ad without there being a very deliberate connection. That's just not how editing works, if we're supposed to believe that it's something other than Don's creativity, the impetus for his creative rebirth happened on this cliff in California. If we're to believe anything other than that, then it wasn't handled properly. But the other possible answer, if it wasn't Don who wrote it, is just that maybe Don found his personal truth and he found that inner peace inside himself that he's been lacking, for the last 8 years that we've known him, and for the last, 20 or so years of his life. But we'll get to this in a little bit, because the other answer, it really depends. As I've said before, I talk about this with friends and with my colleagues at work, and it really was a very big water cooler moment. Monday morning, did you see it? What did you think? I was so confused. One friend hated it. Another friend really liked it, but they were really confused about it, and we had a great discussion about it. But it really comes down to a question of, is the world just a little bit cynical, or is it really, really cynical? So we'll get to that in a little bit. But for now, let's, as we always do, let's not go too far from our format. Let's talk about the meat of the episode. So, person to person. This isn't the end. This is the beginning of something. A few weeks ago, Don said that to a room of his colleagues, and everyone walked away because they just thought he was full of shit, basically. And I even shook my head because I said, no, I thought, Don, you're wrong. This is the end. But maybe Don was right after all, because there were a lot of beginnings in this episode, weren't there? We got to see the beginning of Peggy and Stan's relationship, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The beginning of Pete's new life with Trudy and Tammy in Kansas. The beginning of Roger and Marie in Paris. Seems as though they're happy as well. The beginning of Joan's company. She's beginning her own production company. And yes, arguably, the beginning of Don's triumphant return to New York at the top of his game. So, for a series finale, something that was about endings and the end of an era, this episode had a lot of beginnings. It had a lot of fresh start. And I'm disappointed that we're not going to get a season 8, because there's a lot of creative threads here. You'd like to see what happens next to these characters. There's been some talk of like a reunion movie. I'm pretty sure that's just not going to happen. That's just wishful thinking. But I feel like we could pick up in 10 years and see, what's become of these characters. So the title Person to Person, of course, refers to the phone calls that really drives the narrative in this episode. These person-to-person calls. And the term is actually interesting because it implies that you're only going to pay for the call if you can get that person on the line. If they're not there, there's no charge. There might be different definitions of it, but that's how I understand it. So the three main calls, which were all weighted with such character development, such realization, such really beautiful acting, such important moments. It was with, well, it was basically, now that I'm thinking about it, a simpler way to put it is they were all three with Don and the three most important women in his life. His daughter Sally, his ex-wife Bertie, Betty, and Peggy, his protege, and now, more or less creatively and professionally, his equal, his partner. So a very, very clever title. I really appreciated that. So, as some of you may know, I tried to do a live stream, a Google Hangout on air, and I was just trying to learn the technology. It just occurred to me about halfway through Game of Thrones. I said, I had seen a video on YouTube of people just like reacting to Game of Thrones, and I was just like, people watching TV, is this what it's come to? But then it kind of occurred to me that it's a fun way for those of you who are sort of fans of my reviews, just a different way to connect, a different way to talk about it. And I had a number of people join, and there were some questions and things like that, and it was great. And then I found out later that the audio was missing from the file. I don't know what happened. So I watched it again and did another hangout, watched it again, and was able to figure it out. And you can see the video if you look in the Mad Men playlist. And the thing that struck me is how AMC has done really, really well with the promotional materials for this half season. The Party's Over trailer, which of course we did a video on, was so well done. There was the nostalgia trailer, which is beautiful. It's stands on its own as a work of art, the nostalgia trailer. And then there was the new one, which was done to Paul Anka's Times of Your Life, and it was just a little minute clip that aired right before the episode. And you realize how far these characters have come. I mean, in the first season, when you first meet Sally, she's got the dry cleaning bag over her head. And, you remember the scene where she comes back and Dawn's on the couch and she's showing her ballet. And now, of course, she's a grown woman playing mom, filling in for Betty and helping to raise her two brothers as a surrogate mother figure. But we'll get more into Sally in a little bit. We have a lot to talk about with Sally. So the episode was obviously driven by Dawn and the relationships he has with these three strong female characters. And the reaction to the episode, I've noticed that there's a lot of disappointment, there's a lot of confusion, but I'd like to get into that and help break it down a little bit. So Meredith keeps saying that Dawn's in a better place, and Roger got some good lines where he kept saying, he's not dead, I don't think. And Roger did get a couple good lines tonight. So, the ending, just to touch on it now, it's one of hope and success. And, Don returns to New York, enlightened from his experiences crossing the country, getting to know his demographics of his business in a way that those stuffed shirts in that meeting room, remember again with the roast beef sandwich in the little container, and everyone's turning their binders, everyone's turning the pages in unison. That's not the way to get to know your customer. And I think what Don was doing this whole time was trying to get in touch with what's happening in the country and what's happening with youth, and to sell Coke in a way that only he can. You have to understand the pulse of the country. And those people in that meeting room, they didn't have it. And I wonder, I've talked to some of you in the comments section and in some of the online chats that I've hosted about how Ted's smile takes on a different meaning every time I watch it. Now I wonder if Ted even understood it to that level, that it's not just Don up to his old tricks. Don's going to go do what he does best and show these people at McCann the way it's done. Again, perhaps wishful thinking on my part, but that's what I think of it for today. So Don finds his inner peace, his new you, and he writes the best ad of his career. Coca-Cola. It's been the dream of Don's to go out and win that business, but it's a goal that he couldn't achieve at Sterling Cooper or SCDP or SC&P or any of their iterations. He had to sell his soul to get it and actually go to McCann. But then he went west and he got his soul back. So in a way, Don gets to have his cake and eat it too. Don, he gets to still work on coke, but he's going to do it his way. And you remember that great scene at the end of, I think it was season 6, where Don and Peggy danced to My Way. And it was a beautiful scene. I'm trying to remember if that was the second half of season. I think it was right after the Burger Chef pitch, which was of course, at the midpoint of season 7. I think that would have been Waterloo, but please correct me if I'm wrong. So, the whole episode, I'm asking myself, what is Don doing with Stephanie? And there was a lot of speculation. I wondered, I expected, okay, let me say this. When he first started going west, and that hitchhiker said, I need to get to, I think he said St. Louis, and he said, yep, that's the way I'm going. And that was, of course, west from where he was. I knew he was going to California, and I knew he was going to try to find Stephanie, because that's the only person out there who really knows him in a way that no one in New York really does. Not even Peggy. As much as Peggy's able to help him at the end of the episode, she doesn't know him like Stephanie does. So he goes there trying to find some kind of truth, and I was almost wondering, is he going there just to, offer her money and to try to be sort of like a surrogate father figure to her son? Or does he actually have romantic interest in her? You might remember the pass he made at her in the car, which was obviously very inappropriate. She was 20 years younger than him. But I was just kind of wondering what was his purpose for going to see there and to go to see her. And he's looking for some kind of truth. He's looking for a truth that he can't find within himself. He can't find in New York. He thinks he can find it there. So, we move forever from the imprint that the 50s had on the 60s, that Eisenhower era. And Don leaves behind his suit and his Brill cream. He leaves behind his car and his job and all the trappings of Don Draper. And now he's newly enlightened, and he's ready to remain relevant throughout the 70s and hopefully into the 80s. I mean, that's my wish for Don. And this was his greatest trick. You see, the connection between art and commerce, selling out versus artistic integrity, Don was able to walk that line. And, we think he's this enlightened person, freshly baptized from the cool waters of the Pacific, always going to movies for inspiration, asking people why they buy what they buy and why they feel the way they feel. You might remember in the very first episode, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. He's asking the waiter, why does he smoke Old Gold? And he's saying, it's just what I've always smoked. And Don says, why? He really wanted to get into that man's head and understand the customers and really have an intimate understanding of them, to understand who they are as people, who they are as customers, and to make decisions in his work based on that, based on those findings. And I think it's a really lovely bookend that, 1960, he's talking to this waiter about the war and about why he smokes Old Golds and what it would take to get him to try his Luckies. And now, 10 years later, he's doing the exact same thing. He's going to this retreat. He's sitting on a cliff, meditating, trying to get to know why people do what they do, because he's realizing he's becoming out of touch, and he doesn't want to be out of touch. He doesn't want to review other people's work. He's not going to ever be happy doing that. So he needs to know how people work and how they think in order to sell to them. So, there might be a part of Don that really enjoys this, that this is where he excels, and I really think there is. So a part of him, might still want to do these things, might still want to understand the way people's minds work. If he was, say, working as a mechanic or doing something not related to advertising, he might still have that drive. And I think now that I've really thought about Don in more detail, that his journey has come to an end, at least in the framework of this show, reunion movie. The smile he sort of gives when Betty says she wants to be a psychologist, it's just like he understands people in a way that he would excel in a field like that in a way that Betty never could. Poor Betty. Oh, Betty. So, he can sit in that boardroom forever reading the market data, and he won't learn nearly as much as he can by taking a road trip of self-exploration across this great country of ours. So, as the song implies, the world needs company. The world needs a hug, and he knows the world needs a Coke. If there's money to be made off the isolation and needs of the world, someone will cash in, and why not Don? His grand epiphany on the cliff right here was to mass produce the way he feels sitting on that cliff, and that feeling of finally belonging, and sell it to the world one bottle of Coke at a time. And that's my interpretation of the ending of Mad Men. It's very simple. He's finding a way to commercialize and commoditize this feeling. And it comes from such a pure place, too. These hippies, I'm trying to think if there's a better word. It just sounds like an offensive way to say it, but these hippies, they, eschew world possessions, and they reject commercialism and consumerism. And Don has basically bastardized it in writing this ad, has taken their culture and their way of life to sell a product, to sell something that no one needs. It's junk food. It's sugar water. But he's done it in a brilliant way, a way that made people feel. It made the people feel at the time like their culture was almost, what's the word? It was recognized. It was legitimized in a way that it hadn't been before, because the mainstream showed that they respected it. But in reality, it was much more subversive than that. In reality, they were using it to their own ends to sell a product. So, the funny thing is, Bert Cooper once told Don that a man is whatever room he's in. And Don needed to get in the correct room on that cliffside to be the man that he needed to be. So the funny thing is, last week he was fixing the Coke machine. You might remember that. And that was obviously, I think it was thrown in there as kind of like a red herring. He described himself twice as being retired. And he said, I used to be in advertising. And I think at the time he had given up. And it wasn't until he spoke to Peggy that he knew he had to try. He knew it was okay that he was able to come home. And we'll talk in a second about what home is to Don Draper. So it was around this time that the real McCann Erickson in New York actually, for their Coke account, moved away from the old slogan, things go better with Coke. Things go better with Coca-Cola. Things go better with Coke. That's a much more old-fashioned slogan, and it, didn't appeal to the youth, and it wasn't doing any more favors for Coke. So they had been batting around the slogan of "It's the real thing." And this ad, the song "I'd Like to Buy the World a Coke," actually had its origins. It was January 18th, 1971, at McCann Erickson. So it fits the time frame, fits perfectly. And, Matt Weiner's more or less a genius. No, he's a genius for, I don't know if he thought of this years ago that it was going to end on that ad, or if just writing through seasons 4, 5, and 6, and then thinking about season 7 led him to that conclusion, looking at what was happening at the time. I'm sure you've seen online the screen capture of the girl who Don goes to looking for Stephanie, who kind of runs the front desk more or less at this retreat. And she's dressed the same way as one of the girls in the ad. And I went back and I was watching and I was looking for apple trees and honeybees and snow white turtle doves, and I was coming up a little bit empty. Might have been a little bit too on the nose. But it's a fun thing to try. So it's funny thinking about making money off this altruistic movement, this sort of hippie commune. But it is always about money. You might notice when Don checks in, he makes sort of a donation as he says, "Thank you for your generosity." Of course they're there to make money. They may have designs on a greater ideal, but at the end of the day, they need to make money just like we all do. So Don is at his lowest point, slumped on the ground by that phone booth. He's dragged into a group therapy session where he connects with Leonard, who has a dream about wanting to be a Coke, more or less. He's saying that he has this recurring dream where he starts by saying that his family doesn't love or respect him, and maybe they love him, but they just don't even know if he's there. They don't care when he's gone. And that's something that Don's been struggling with, the fact that his family, it's, Betty later says to him, you'll see the kids as much as you do now if you were to come back to New York. And that really hits him because he realizes, and we've talked about this before, that they don't really need him. Especially with Henry Francis, who I was disappointed we didn't see tonight. We saw everybody else. He just isn't needed, especially with, like I said, with Henry. He has the money to support them, so they don't even need Don's money. And that's one of the only things he can offer people at times is that financial stability. So this man mirrors Don's fears about being, to use the analogy that the man Leonard was his name uses, being left in the fridge, and people open the door and they're all having fun and they look and they don't pick you because they don't need you or they don't want you. So then you close the door and then you're alone and you're in the dark. You're unwanted. It's a really disturbing image. It's a horrible place to think you are in your life. And I think the reality for Leonard is hopefully not that bleak, but that's the way he feels. So, Don's clear that his family doesn't need him and they don't even know he's gone. And Sally, despite her protestations, which in some ways are just trying to honor Betty's wishes, but in reality it's the truth that he doesn't even need to come home. Before we go too far, let's talk a little bit about these 3 phone calls because it ties into what we're talking about right now, and it's the heart of the whole episode. So the first one is with Sally, and he's just talking to her about what he's doing running around the country. And she tells him that Betty's dying. And of course, he brushes it off at first, but she says, "No, Dad, listen to me. She has lung cancer. She's got 6 months to live." And you can see Don gets very serious naturally. And he says, I'm coming back to New York right now. And she basically tells him, don't bother. We don't need you. We're going to go live with our aunt and uncle. Mom doesn't want you to come back. And that she's betraying her trust, even telling him about it. So to have your own daughter say, don't even bother coming home. So that's got to hurt him in a way that not much else can. So it was only because of her protestations there that he doesn't get on a plane immediately, and it lets us still appreciate him as a character. If she had said, "Oh, Dad, come home now," and he had delayed, he would have been irredeemable, I think, in the eyes of the viewer. But he actually has a great reason to not go back because he's told very firmly, "Don't come back. We don't need you." So his next call is to Betty, and he tells her that Betty knows. And they have a really beautiful conversation. The acting is superb. And I want to give a lot of credit to John Hamm, I'm going to try to say it, Kiernan Shipka, am I saying that correctly? January Jones, and of course, Elizabeth Moss. Because to have these 3 powerful Emmy-worthy scenes, and you're not even in the same room, you're not even looking at the other person. You're just on the phone. Phone calls can be very difficult to shoot and really get an emotional impact. And they pulled the hat trick tonight. They got all 3 of them and they hit them perfectly. They were executed beautifully. So the next one, like we were talking about, he's talking to Betty. And that scene where he says, "Bertie," and she just says, "I know." There's so much unspoken between them. There's so much regret. There's so much understanding. It's the kind of scene you can't get from a movie because you don't have years and years building up these characters, really giving us insight to them. And I know a lot of people have hated on January Jones, have hated on Betty Draper Francis, but at the end of the day, she was a real character, and she was like a real person. She had flaws, she had strengths. She showed a tremendous amount of grace and class. She's also shown a tremendous amount of immaturity. And at the end of the day, she was a well-rounded character. She was accurate for what she was trying to be and who she was trying to portray. So I like to give a lot of credit to January Jones for this character. And like I said, I know a lot of people, Betty's not their favorite character, but particularly in this episode, she handled it very well. So Don's family doesn't even know he's gone a lot of the time. And, Sally gives him a purpose in coming home, and we've been hoping that he comes home, but they're telling him that they don't need him, and it's so clear he's needed there. The scene where Bobby is trying to make dinner and he's burning what looked like bread, and Jean is just sitting there, and they're just trying to make it because Henry is at some sort of a convention, and Betty can't even get out of bed now. I want to say, why don't they have some kind of a housekeeper or some kind of a nanny coming by to help out? But Bobby is really holding his own. And the scene where Sally comes in and they, like 2 surrogate parents, tell Jean to get out of the room and they're arguing. It was a powerful scene. It was heartbreaking, but it was very well done. And I'd like to give the 5th actor, or whatever, to play Bobby a lot of credit because he pulled this scene off beautifully. And you've got to feel so bad for Jean. The scene later where one of the people in Don's therapy session says to Stephanie that her child is going to spend his whole life just like this woman did, looking at the door, waiting for her to walk in. And you've got to think that Gene feels kind of the same way about his dad. I'm sure Bobby does as well, but poor Gene. So Sally and Bobby just are bickering like two parents. And we see Betty slowly succumb as Sally washes the dishes. And she's stepped up. She's there to help with her brothers. And really thank God for Sally, because the boys need her. And Betty needs her help. And when Betty's gone, they're going to need someone. They're going to need some sort of an adult in the house besides either Henry or the aunt and uncle, someone who knows them and who really cares about them. And I hope that I'm right, and Don does go back to New York, and he's part of that, because I think it's the last part of Don's journey that he needs to accept. But we'll touch on that. We're wrapping up here. So the man, Leonard, says, it's like no one cares that I'm gone. They should love me. Maybe they do. But I don't even know what it is. You spend your whole life thinking you're not getting it. People aren't giving it to you. Then you realize they're trying, but you don't even realize what it is. And it really takes me back to Pete's conversation last week with his brother, where he's talking about always needing something more, always needing the next thing, and never really stopping and being happy with what you have. And that's been a real theme in this show, but also in this season. And it's something that, Don, in that first episode, seems to have it all. He's got a great career. He's got a beautiful family, a beautiful house. He's got 2 healthy children, and he's just not happy. He needs more. He's not satisfied with what he has. And that's what really the show is about. It's, can you be satisfied with what you have? That's a big theme of the show. Don's asked us before, what is happiness? It's a moment before you need more happiness. It's that feeling of never being satisfied, of never being satiated. And that's really the sickness of Mad Men. It's the truth that some people do live that way. They're always craving more and they're never satisfied. So the third phone call with Peggy, she assures him that he can come home. She says, I know you get sick of things and you run away, but you can come home. And Peggy knows him more than anyone, really, even if she doesn't know all the details of who Dick Whitman is. He confessed to the veterans last week about what really happened in that when they were building that field hospital. And that's something he can't admit to Peggy, and Peggy is never going to know him that way, but she knows, she may not know Dick Whitman, but she knows Don Draper in a way that really no one else does. So she's the one, not Sally, not Betty, who can tell Don to come home. She's the only one who could do it. But what is home to Don Draper? Is it with Gene and Bobby? Could be. Is it with Stephanie helping raise her son? I don't think so. He's not needed there. She doesn't even want his money. She turns down his money. So he thinks it's either on the road or maybe in this commune. Maybe he was thinking about starting another life, a third identity. Maybe he was thinking about starting over. Maybe he was thinking about just staying there forever in this commune. But Peggy reminds him that home to Don Draper, and this is the point of the episode in the show, more or less, is that his home is at the office. I've said many times that that's where the heart of this show is. That's where my love for the show comes from, is the scenes in the office. It's the deals. It's the pitches. It's the partners' meetings. That's where the show's heartbeat really lies for me. That's where its soul is. And that's what Peggy tells Don, that you can come home. And she doesn't mean go back to your apartment. She doesn't mean go and see Betty. She means come back to work. Don't you want to work on coke? She says. That's always been his dream, and he has the opportunity to do it, and he does it. So, just to touch on some of the subplots very quickly, the scenes with Peggy and Stan. I've said before that Stan never really clicked as a character for me, but he, in the last few episodes, has really come into his own and filled a void in Peggy's life that she needs. It wasn't with that gentleman who had the job interview in Washington. Stan is Peggy's equal in many ways. He's come up and gotten where he is through hard work. He's very talented and creative in those scenes where she just wants him on the other end of the phone. It was beautiful to see Stan. He came to the realization that he loved Peggy a while ago, I think. And it took him a minute to really admit it. I like the look he gives his colleague over the shoulder to basically get out. I'm on the phone, and he leaves. But Stan's known it for a while, and he just admits it to Peggy. But Peggy realizes it right in that call. She says, I don't even think about you. And she says, well, of course I do. I mean, you're there. I mean, you're here. And it was beautiful just to watch her face. Again, another very important conversation that happened over the phone. To see her realize that in real time was a masterstroke. It was beautiful. And then when she's like, hello, hello, I knew he's running upstairs right now, or wherever he is. And he stands at the door, and he's kind of a little out of breath, and he goes, you were saying? It was great. I'm debating saying, like, was it, as I've been reading some message boards, and some people think it was a little tacked on, it was a little corny, but it really rang true for me. It was something that they'd been building to for a long time, and it rang true. So I loved it. I loved the scene between Peggy and Pete when he gives her the cactus and says, I have a 5-year-old. It's great that he's thinking of Tammy's safety. He's thinking of someone other than himself now. But he took the job at Learjet, and he jumped. And it was just really great to see that last little scene that just shows him and Trudy and Tammy getting off the plane, and they're going to start their new life in Kansas. That was great just to see them happy. Like we talked about before, this was an episode of beginnings. So the scene between him and Peggy was also very, very well done. And there was so much there unsaid between them, but he has actually come to a place in his life and in his maturity, and he's realized he can pay her that compliment. You'll make creative director by 1980. I think it'll be a lot sooner than that. I think she takes her career counselor's advice and doesn't stay at McCann for 10 years. She works there for a few years, and she builds up a name for herself. She works on her book, and then she jumps ship and either starts her own agency or goes to a smaller one where she can be creative director a lot sooner and really work on what she wants to work on and not be a cog in a giant machine. The scenes where she holds her own against that other woman and basically takes a page from her mentor, Dawn, and says, let's go talk to him together, and just stands her ground and gets what she wants, gets her way. Dawn always gets what he wants. She gets her way, was also good. And it was nice. I've talked before about how Peggy, we didn't need to see her this week, but I was wrong. It was great to see her. It was great to see her at McCann. The scenes between her and Joan were very, very well done. I think it rang true for her character that she turns down Joan's job offer to kind of start a new agency. That's not what she needs right now, to start over, to start fresh, but that's exactly what Joni needs. Joan, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. Richard, what an asshole. I'm sorry to say it that way, but you can see how excited she is. Just to basically tell her, let me in your son's life. And then she starts a business, and he's buttoning his shirt, and he says, good luck, Joni, or whatever he said to her. Why would he root for her to fail so they can spend time together? There's still time. He can be there and support her. But they're just not right for each other, and Richard should have realized that immediately. That they're just in very different places in their life. They didn't sync up. It wasn't the right time for them. And it would never be the right time because Richard's a jerk. But he should have realized that they were not a good match and not strung Joan along. Another red herring when they were doing coke. That's the real thing. Wow. So, speaking of the 80s, right? So, Roger and Marie, the scenes with them in the hotel room, I liked Roger's sort of comedic beats. It was good. I don't really care much about him and Marie. But the scene at the end where they're in Paris and he says, get some whatever from my mother. It was just great to see that he hasn't lost a sense of humor. It's still Roger. He's going to enjoy his retirement just like I said he would and just sort of fade into the background and just count his money. And it was beautiful that he did not forget his son, Kevin, and he did right by him and Joan and said, basically, he's getting half my fortune, whatever's left after Jane took her half. But great to see that he acknowledged Kevin and that Joan accepted his generosity, because now Kevin won't have to worry, she won't have to worry about him being taken care of. And it came at a great time too, because Roger knows how much money she lost on the McCann deal when Jim Hobart basically said he never wanted to see her face again. And the line where Kevin sort of ignores him and Roger calls him a rich bastard. That was a beautiful line. That was probably one of the best lines of the night. So, Holloway and Harris, I'm glad Joan is doing it. She's doing it herself. She's doing it her way. And I wish her a lot of luck. There was a little thing on the Bullseye in Entertainment Weekly on the back page, if you've ever read that magazine, where it shows Peggy and Joan, and it says spinoff. And I know that they're not going to do it. I don't think that they can pull a Better Call Saul out of the Mad Men universe. But I wish they would, because I think the world needs more of, especially those characters. Those are two strong female characters in a man's world. And well, it's obviously the tide's turning by 1970. But it's still very much the odds are against them in the business world. And those are two strong women who can change the world by working hard and just through their sheer force of will and their talent. So I would like to see a spin-off with Joan and Peggy, or even just with Joan's business. She could hold the show. Maybe Pete pops in once in a while. Ken Cosgrove, it was nice to see him again, and it was very appropriate that he gave Joan the idea to start her own production company. I mean, was it $25,000 she stands to make on one ad? So, is it possible that the ending is more cynical than what I've outlined? Again, my interpretation is that Don finds this moment of peace. Basically, that was his trick. It was his plan all along to go out there and find inspiration. Maybe he didn't know it at first. Maybe he thought he was just going to ride the rails forever. But I think the real purpose of him walking out of that meeting was he knew he can't sell to people that way. That's not the way he does business. So now he finally got the creative spark he needed to write one of the best, most lasting and important ads of all time. That ad really did change the world. And it really made an impact on people and on Coke. People would call radio stations just wanting to hear the song before there was even a TV ad for it. So that's my interpretation, that Don thinks of that ad and he appropriates the experience he had to sell it, to basically bottle what he learned on that cliff and sell it to people to make money. Because that's what he does, and that's where his home is. His home is in the office. His home is with his work. I hope he's a father to his kids, and he steps up in that regard. And just it's difficult to think of what Peggy is going through in the scene. We talked about January Jones before. The scene, she has no makeup on. She looks terrible, but it was brave of her to do that scene, and it's just. As I've talked about before, I've had family go through cancer, in particular lung cancer, and it's not pretty. Even in 2015, it's not pretty. But in 1970, to handle it with the grace and class that she did was beautiful. So, as I said, is it possible the ending is far more cynical? The other take on the ending that I've heard argued, and that actually makes sense to me, even though it's not what I choose to believe, is that Don merely finds personal truth, and he finds he finds the truth inside himself and the self-actualization that he was looking for, but it has nothing to do with the ad. I'm trying to think how to see, because I've thought about it a lot, and this isn't really what I believe, so it's kind of hard to argue for it. But the fact that I'll just read what I wrote, because I actually wrote down the actual thoughts. So that I'd like to buy the world of Coke was a counterpoint to the honest discovery Don had along his odyssey, where he saw some of the best and some of the worst of people, and to show how Madison Avenue, thousands of miles away, inevitably stole this pure moment and commercialized it and bastardized it and made money off it. So it's either Don did it and it was his trick all along, or it's just that you can't stop it no matter what. Even though Don turned out to be a better person in the end and learned something about himself, you're not going to stop Madison Avenue. You're not going to stop the free market and commerce. They're going to take it and they're going to use it just to make money and just for their stock price. So is that Matt Weiner's last jab at the world of advertising, or is it Don's triumphant return to New York at the absolute top of his game? That's what I choose to believe. That's what I got from it. I think the woman who was expressing sadness towards Stephanie hit the nail on the head that, you know, the baby will spend the rest of his life looking at the door, and I really hope that that is not what Bobby and Jean have in store for them. Even though Betty insinuates that Don's quest for redemption is futile, he would do well to remember that it's not too late to be a father to Bobby and Jean. I'm sorry I keep harping on that, but it hits very close to home. As you know, I have 3 girls of my own, and I can't imagine driving to California, leaving them behind, and just writing checks. So, you know, Don is far enough away from this aching nostalgia for the past that gave us the carousel pitch and that Hershey's anti-pitch. He's actually come far enough as a person to actually want to give the world a hug. He's progressed and grown that much that this master of the universe, as I've heard him call it, Don Draper, wants to give the world a hug and keep it company. So perhaps he can go back to that place where he aches to go again and where he knows he feels loved. He can go back to New York and around and back again to that place where he knows he's loved. So the beauty of the ending is that the choice is yours. There were too many hints at Coke in these last few episodes for it to not mean that Don wrote the ad, but it's a compelling argument either way. So, as we leave Mad Men behind, I might do one more video talking about the show as a whole. But it's a show that's meant a lot to me. It's meant a lot to my family. I've talked about how I would watch the episodes with my Nana in Florida, and we would either kind of be on the phone watching them, or we would email back and forth and talk the next day. She'd say, "Did you see Dawn?" And we would talk about the episode, and that's where all Betty comes from, because we didn't like Betty much at the time. She came up and spent a summer with us, and we actually watched all 5 seasons. We'd watch 1 or 2 every night and drink Canadian Club. And those are memories that I'll always have, and it's thanks to this show. That show brought us closer and brought us together, because there's not a lot of, you know, shows and movies that we agreed on that we had in common. You know, she would never watch, well, I wouldn't say that. She was a wonderful woman. I was going to say she would never watch a Breaking Bad, but she may very well have. One of her favorite shows was Hung on HBO, or Showtime, whatever network that show was on, Hung, and she would always talk about it. And I just want to thank just Mad Men, just a final toast to Mad Men. It was a beautiful show. This is the end of an era. I'm sad it's over, but what a ride. And if I had my own time machine, I know that there's a place that I ache to go to again, where I know that I'm loved. But at least we have these memories. Thank you for sharing this finale with me. Thank you for sharing this season with me. I've appreciated your views and your comments and your support. So, thanks very much. We'll see you next time.